There we go. Hello, y'all, and welcome to Latin American politics. This is going to be chapter one, the introduction, or chapter zero, basically. Um, I'm going to try to break this down into multiple chapters, especially when we get to the case studies. Each individual case study will be an individual lecture, regardless of how long or short it is. Um, Basically, the breakdown of the class is that we'll study the structure, society, politics, economics of the region first, the history, and then in the units 2 through 4, we're going to do case studies of about 18 countries, I believe, somewhere around there. We didn't include the entire list. Some of them are, maybe a little too small or a little too politically unimportant, I would say. And then I also left out Haiti. If you're interested, it's an absolute mess. You should go look into it. There's been assassinations of their presidents. There's been coups. There's been, right now it's basically just gangs running the country. It's an absolute mess. But it doesn't really fit the model. It wasn't a Spanish colony. It's a French colony. Basically one of the only ones. It's in the Caribbean. So we're gonna try to mainly focus on the mainland. I did include Costa Rica because it is a really good example of an actual functioning democracy in Latin America, which is hard to come by, other than say maybe Uruguay. Some of the others, even Argentina and Brazil, that you think of, still have some problems. So we'll talk about those as we get through class. The papers are all going to be 1,500 words. We'll have 4 papers. I'll usually post the lectures and then I'll post the assignment after the lectures. This will give you about 7 to 10 days to do your assignments. Um, I do that for a reason. I'm moving more toward a model where everything looks more like grad school, law school, or sort of the professional field where you get shortened timelines. Here's the assignment. We need this done this week. Next week we're going to move on to something else. So, I'm the more of the sort of pedagogy literature I read, the more I'm moving toward this model. I know it's hard because it's a short, sort of compact term, but I think it really prepares you for what the real world looks like instead of just having all of your assignments laid out in front of you all at once. Okay. Again, the papers will be 1,500 words. You'll have to use 4 legitimate citations, one of which may be the book. Regardless of how many times you cite the book or which pages or whatever, it's only going to count as one. And then you'll have to find to teach you to learn to cite, to learn to do good research, things of this sort. I absolutely love data and graphics. I think that's the sort of wave of the future when it comes to research, reporting, etc. So, anytime you can throw some data in there or some graphics that you found that sort of help you bolster your argument, the better. Um, this class is going to be a little different from most of the political science classes because it's such a case study focused course. We're going to get a lot of history along with the politics, right? Whereas most of the political science courses tend to focus on modern day theories, and we'll try to do that as much as possible in here. A lot of this is going to be, colonial history and things that go back hundreds of years. So we need to touch on some of that stuff before we really even get into the case studies. Okay, I think that's it. If anyone has any questions for me, please email me. Or you even have my private personal phone number. You can text me at any time. Once again, I do not accept phone calls and I will not check your voicemails, but you may text me anytime. I try to be incredibly available. So, like, even if you need to meet me at midnight because you work weird hours or you got kids or whatever, like, just reach out to me. We'll figure out a time to meet that's good for you because most times are going to be good for me. Okay. Okay, so given that, let's dive in. Chapter 0 is just sort of a historical introduction, and they talk about the framework of the book. And we'll just touch on it for a minute here. I do want you to know that the vast majority of Latin America were Spanish colonies, right? And so a lot of that Iberian principles, a lot of the Iberian history and tradition from Spain get moved over into Latin America. Um, And then you also have Portugal, who fought and won Brazil and really helped to at least bolster up their coasts, right? They weren't all that involved in the inland because, right, it's really difficult to sort of work your way all the way up the Amazon or through the Amazon forest, etc. And so you see most of the infrastructure, at least the ports and all that kind of stuff, on the coasts. Let's see. You have some British islands in the Caribbean. We're not really going to focus on any of those because they don't really fit the model. Again, they're generally teeny tiny countries. They have a vastly different historical and cultural background than does most of Latin America. Okay, Latin America, I would say at this point is mostly democratic, at least since the 1980s, when basically Brazil's military junta gave up power in the early 1980s. There has been major movement toward democratization, especially as we'll talk about because the IMF and the World Bank and the US have basically pushed very, very hard internally and externally for these countries to become democracies to be able to qualify for loans, grants, things of that sort. There has been slippage, though, is one thing that I would like to point out. There's a lot of argument that Mexico's democracy is slipping, that the checks and balances are being degraded under the Moreno party and under Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who was known as AMLO, who was their former president until about 2 weeks ago, Claudia Sheinbaum took office. And then you have Argentina with Milei. Argentina has always had severe debt crisis problems. They have some real problems with their institutions that we'll talk about. And now you have this sort of hyper libertarian um, economist, Millet, who has come into office and is trying to just completely shake things up. So nobody really knows how that's going to play out at the moment. So we'll see. Things have been surprisingly good, I would say, up to this point. A lot of international media was very critical or skeptical of Millet um, running up to his presidency and even shortly after, and yet we've seen some real turnaround in Argentina. But whether they can keep that up in the long run is a tough question. We know that there's real problems with Peru with drugs. We know there's real problems with Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua and El Salvador. These countries in the Central American corridor, where all of these gangs and basically drug outfits are looking to fight for territoriality, fight for power, fight for pieces of the urban centers, and so they are very, very high crime. They have some of the highest murder, rape, etc. rates on the planet right now. And so this is the reason that many of them are flooding into Mexico and in turn into the United States. Most of the immigration we'll talk about later is not coming from Mexico right now. It's coming from these Central American corridor countries, Guatemala, Venezuela, which is in South America because their country is completely collapsing. But Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, those countries are all, I mean, they're all collapsing, right? And we'll talk about the U.S. having at least part responsibility in what happened in that central corridor, at least later in the course. So, and then the final one, we're not going to do a case study about it, but Haiti, I would point out, is completely collapsing. Right? They've had assassinations of their presidents. Their president fled. He went to South Africa, basically no, to Kenya. Excuse me, to Kenya, basically begging for Kenyan troops and Kenyan military, uniformed military officers. He wanted 2,000 of them to come to Haiti to protect the country and to fight against the gangs. While he left, the gangs took over. It's been a complete mess. There is rampant starvation, corruption, violence. If you want to drive your car, you got to pay a fee at every like stoplight, basically, to the gangs so that you can get to work if your work's even open, right? Which is likely not. So there are severe problems, and one of the bigger problems there is that these diseases that most of mankind thinks to have been beaten back are sort of on the rise. Yellow fever, scarlet fever. Um, there are even worries about smallpox returning to places like Haiti that are just completely collapsed countries. So okay, so moving on, I would also point out that their sort of political system looks a lot different from ours. There are, as corrupt as you might think the United States is, Latin America is far, far worse, right? They literally buy votes. They will literally just send, national money down to the local level in exchange for quid pro quo, right? For, votes or for this or that. Yeah, it's pretty nasty down there when it comes to patronage and corruption. And a lot of these countries, as we'll learn about, for a long time, at least until their economies collapsed, and the PRI in Mexico was really famous for this, for just giving anyone who was a crony or a family member or like someone who could help them out with some votes or whatever, you all get a government job, right? Everyone gets a government job. And so in some of these countries, like 40 to 60% of the entire economy was quote unquote government jobs, right? Public service jobs, which completely collapsed because that's not viable in the long run, right? You have to actually have economic productivity. You can't just have a massive bureaucracy. But it was a way that the PRI in Mexico basically paid off votes. Even if you're pissed off with the way the party's functioning, you just give them a government job and a salary, and it's a cush job. They don't really do anything. It's kind of like if you look at Oman and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, right? Everybody gets a government job and it's all free, but it's because they have oil money, whereas Latin America didn't. They were just borrowing. Okay, they all have extremely strong military influences. There is a very, very high number of all of the military juntas on Earth. A very high percentage of them were from Latin America historically. Part of this is because of the machismo in Latin America. Part of it is because of the cultural and historical aspects of, as they were being colonized. Um, the Spanish are also fighting off the Muslim Moors, right, in Spain. And so just as Columbus is landing in America or the Americas in 1492, that is the same year that the Moors were finally defeated in this 7th century fight against the Moors, the Spanish Inquisition, and all of these things. And so they had a very tyrannical, top to bottom, hierarchical, militaristic perspective on culture and on politics and on the role of kings and generals as being important in society. And so all of that sort of got passed on to the haciendas and et cetera in Latin America as they're being colonized, right? Okay. I would also point out that finally, I guess two more things. When it comes to institutions, almost all of the houses of South America or Latin America are proportional representation, right? They're chosen by PR, but almost none of them are prime ministerships, right? Almost all of them are presidential or even what they call hyper presidential systems, where the you have a very, very powerful president. And it's not like it is in the United States or Europe, where each branch, the judicial, the legislative, the executive, are co-equal, right? It's where you have the presidency, and then below them you have the legislative chambers, who are basically just there to say, yes, the president's laws are cool, or no, they're not, or we want to make some adjustments. And the courts, who often bow to the president, right? And so there's some very concerning aspects about the political institutions in Latin America, where you don't necessarily have co-equal branches. You have a very, very powerful presidency, and sometimes those presidents take advantage of that. Okay, section 2 is a framework for analysis. Unit 1 is going to be an historical and political review of Latin America, its societies, its institutions, and Units 2 through 4 are case studies like we talked about in the intro. There will be 6 focuses in the book. The first is political culture. Again, this is often very sort of machismo and often autocratic. You have the vast majority of military junta takeovers or military coups in South America, so militaries are very beefed up in South America. The second is economic change, right? We've had lots of economic change from colonialism and mercantilism to liberal economic policies run by the very, very wealthy, the elites in society, to sort of a more mixed Marxist system in the sort of 50s through 70s, through what's called bureaucratic administration. And then after the collapse of South America from debt problems and hyperinflation in many countries like Argentina, Venezuela, etc., you get sort of forced neoliberalization by the US, the IMF, and the World Bank, which we'll talk about. And then economically, I should also point out that you have enormous levels of poverty in that country, in the region still, not that country, and some of the worst inequality on earth, right? If you take the Gini index, which is produced by the University of Texas that measures inequality, um, the inequality regionally is the highest on earth in South America. And then Brazil, I believe, is the most unequal country in the world, at least in those countries where you can, get a measurement. Um, let's see. The third is social change, right? So we have deep roots in sort of autocracy and in Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, but we are getting some pushback, as we would expect from sort of Inglehart's modernization theory and postmodernism. You have much greater political organization now. Finally, sort of post 1990s, you're getting a lot more allowance of political organizations by the state through indigenous groups, green groups, labor unions, women's organizations, etc. They largely just were not allowed before. You're also seeing rising Protestantism, and this is mostly evangelical or LDS, Latter day Saints, Mormonism, whatever you want to call it. And then to this day, probably the biggest divide in South America is the urban rural, right? And many, many things are based on this urban rural divide, whether it be, poverty, whether it be access to medicine, whether it be, what is it called? Child mortality or infant mortality, whether it be your longevity, like how long do you live. All of these different things are in many, many ways tied to the rural urban divide because there's still so much land in South America that has not yet really been developed in any way, right? Okay. The fourth focus is going to be political institutions. We are getting increased pluralism. So, as I talked about earlier, we have seen not only elections and suffrage increase, we've seen the allowance of organizations to actually participate in the system as what we call in the United States interest groups, right? So, we see increased pluralism. We do unfortunately see huge personalistic candidacies in South America, which can be a real problem. In Europe, there's a lot of party control, right? So everything is largely based on the party. Everybody sort of toes the party line. America, a little less than in Europe. But in Latin America, it's very personalistic, right? Like you have to build your own personal brand. You're even competing against your own party members in many of these situations. They'll put up, like, say, in Brazil, where it's PR, they'll put up all of the party lists, right? And you have to vote for individual members inside that party. And so you're not only competing with the other parties, you're competing with your own political your own political members. So it can be really troubling. Another problem is that you get a huge explosion in the number of political parties because of this system, which can really bog down the system. which is often why the president has so much power because the legislature just can't get anything done. Let's see. We also have a lot of what I would call pseudo democracies. There's a lot of different names for these, like illiberal democracies, pseudo democracies, electoral autocracies, whatever the hell you want to call it. They have sort of the functions and the facade of a democracy, sort of like Russia, right? Like they have elections, but everybody knows Putin and the Putin party are going to win, right? So it's sort of the same in Venezuela. Ever since Hugo Chavez, their democracy has been in tatters, and then Maduro has made things even worse. Haiti, which we talked about, is a complete disaster. Guatemala is an absolute disaster right now. They have some of the highest murder rates on earth. And then Colombia from like 1955 until like the mid 90s. And they had what was called La Violencia, which is, a fight against the guerrillas and the communists and the drug lords, and then like name a group that could fight against the government. And Colombia had them. And so this 30 to 40-year period was called La Violencia, the violence. And honestly, like the church had to step in. They had to promise, like the gang leaders, that they would not convict them. They even let some of them be like senators and stuff, just to get them to put down their weapons and stop fighting. So I shouldn't even be laughing. It's messed up, right? But yeah, they had like 40 years of violence, La Violencia. You also have real problems with free media in Latin America. Um, there is there's a lot of skepticism of media, right? A lot of that was pushed, like it was in America by Donald Trump, was pushed in Latin America by Jair Bolsonaro, Evo Morales of Bolivia, and Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, and some of those others sort of far right. Even though, Evo Morales is, I guess, not far right, he's probably far left. But anyway, there's been a lot of sort of control of media, um, takeover of media when there were military juntas in charge, murder and disappearances of journalists. There are some really concerning trends in South America. And then the last two focuses will be public policy, of course, which we'll get to, and then sort of the international environment and how international affairs affect Latin American politics. Okay, that's going to be the first chapter. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll get the next one up soon. Have a great day.